More Asian Americans voted in the 2020 presidential election than in any other election in history. Nationally, there was voter turnout increase of over 40% when compared to the 2016 presidential election. Turnout of Asian American voters doubled in 2020 for Texas, and in Arizona, the number of Asian American voters that turned out increased by 80%. These are just examples of how we must strengthen our efforts to protect voting rights for all. We also made history in electing Vice President Kamala Harris, the first Asian and Black female vice president. It is thanks to voters that we are now seeing a light at the end of the tunnel of this pandemic. On top of this, Asian Americans have dealt with the dual pandemic of anti-Asian sentiment and hate, which along with racial justice as a whole, was a major concern of Asian Americans who voted in this election.
It's saddening that we first have to repair the damages done by the Supreme Court to the operation of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which of course is one of the issues in the bills that we're talking about. We're thinking about ways to make sure that people can register more easily, that indeed people can get to the polls more easily, that we think more about where polling sites are, making them actually even easier to get to for the American people.
Today, many Native American reservations are rural, distant from the nearest off-reservation border town because of official policies to forcibly remove and segregate them on remote and undesirable land. Travel to voting services, DMVs, and post offices can be hundreds of miles away. Less than 10 years ago, in South Dakota, Native American voters were degraded and forced to vote out of a chicken coop. In Wisconsin, voters were forced to vote where the sheriff's office was, and patrol cars were checking the plates of every car leaving the reservation on Election Day, intimidating voters. In 2018, a San Juan County clerk in Utah committed fraud to kick the Native American candidate off of the ballot, who was only reinstated after a federal court ordered it. Overt discrimination remains a present-day problem in need of present-day solutions.
And just to remind you of the context that we are in right now, voting rights in America are under attack like they haven't been since the Jim Crow era. The Brennan Center has been tracking legislation to restrict access to voting for over a decade. And it is the push to restrict access to voting in state legislatures is unprecedented in this time period in terms of both volume and intensity. As of a month ago, and we have a new count coming out soon, it is not yet ready, but as of a month ago, there were more than 360 bills to roll back voting rights pending in 47 states. That is a dramatic increase over any year beforehand.
The big issue, of course, as we know, is that Texas may also flip with the growth of the Latino population. Latinos are now 40% of the population of Texas, our second most populous state, a state that just this week gained 2 more representatives in the House of Representatives, and whose power is only projected to grow in the future. But the growth of Latino participation in elections in Texas is a threat. If Texas flips, like these other states have flipped, the whole calculus of presidential elections will change permanently. That is the threat perceived by certain political forces that are behind efforts to suppress voting by everyone, but particularly in communities of color, and I would say particularly in the Latino community. Latinos are often, implicitly or explicitly, those who are accused by leaders like Donald Trump of engaging in voter fraud without a shred of evidence. And so much of the voter suppression legislation we see being proposed and enacted today, whether in Georgia or perhaps soon in Texas, Arizona, and other states, is justified by concerns unsupported by facts about voter fraud. We need to ensure that we are targeting not just the serial vote killers, but the copycat vote killers as well, and the legislation that is to be considered in Congress would ensure that we do that. So I join my colleagues in working together to get the people whose voices need to be heard to let their representatives know how important these two pieces of legislation, the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, are to the future of democracy as our demographics change in this country.